You know that saying, think globally, act locally? Well, today we're diving into what happens when that global part starts to feel really, really personal, like it's hitting close to home.
Yeah, definitely.
We're tackling these huge questions about ethics in a world that just keeps getting more interconnected.
Right.
You send over some excerpts from a chapter called The Ethics Problem Nobody Talks About.
Uh-huh.
And wow, it's really making me rethink how my own choices, like everyday decisions, stack up against these massive problems in the world.
It's a question that's more relevant now than ever, I think. Like, we've inherited these ethical systems, right?
Right.
But they were made for a world that's so different from the one we live in now.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. The chapter argues that traditional ethics focuses on individual actions.
Yeah.
Like, what's the right thing for me to do in this situation? But issues like climate change, they don't really care about my personal carbon footprint, right?
No.
It's more about what entire countries or these big industries are doing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, those old village maps?
Yeah.
And you try to use one to navigate a huge city? You'll get lost, right?
Yeah.
The landmarks might still be there, but you're missing so much crucial info.
Yeah, you need a new map.
Yeah, exactly. And the chapter, it uses this great analogy of a village growing into a global network. Like, our ethical systems came about in those small villages where the things you did only really affected the people around you.
Right.
But now it's like that village exploded outward.
Yeah.
Connecting everyone and everything. So something you decide to do over here, it can have ripple effects halfway across the planet.
So even if I'm like super diligent about recycling,
Yeah.
it's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the plastic that big companies are churning out, right?
Right.
It feels good to try to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But does it even make a difference at that scale?
Oh, it's definitely important. Individual actions matter.
Okay.
They show what we value.
Yeah.
And they can inspire other people. But we do need more to connect personal ethics with actual systemic change,
Right. Yeah.
The chapter makes a good point that the old ways of thinking about ethics, the traditional frameworks, they just aren't equipped to deal with these problems that affect the whole planet.
So it's not that traditional ethics is wrong. It's just it's not enough anymore.
It's just out of its depth. That's a great way to put it.
Oh, okay.
And one of the biggest places where we see this is in how we struggle with thinking about the long term.
Yeah, that whole me right now versus everyone in the future problem.
Exactly.
Like, we know climate change is a threat, but it's hard to actually do something about it right now. It's easier to just hit the snooze button on it.
And there's a reason for that. It's biology, We're wired to prioritize immediate rewards and immediate threats. Like, our ancestors weren't exactly worried about the long-term consequences of burning fossil fuels, right? But that short-term thinking, it really gets in the way when we're dealing with problems that unfold over decades, even centuries.
It's like we're playing hot potato with a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Like, each generation gets a little closer to the explosion, but we keep passing it on. The chapter, it uses fossil fuels as an example.
Yeah.
We get to enjoy cheap energy now,
Right.
but the cost gets pushed onto future generations.
Yeah.
They're the ones who will really feel the effects of climate change.
Exactly. Traditional ethics really struggles with this idea of responsibility to people who haven't even been born yet.
Yeah.
How do we weigh the needs of the present against the rights of people in the future?
Yeah.
Philosophers have been trying to figure that out for ages. The chapter doesn't give us any easy answer.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the individual versus the collective,
Yeah.
and then short-term versus long-term thinking.
Yeah.
What other ethical roadblocks are we hitting in this globalized world?
Well, the chapter points to nationalism. It's a major obstacle because often our ethical systems get intertwined with national identity. And that makes it really, really tough to find common ground when we need the whole world to cooperate.
Yeah, right. It's like every country is building its own little ethical lifeboat, but we're all stuck in the same storm.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's like it leads to what's called the tragedy of the commons.
Okay.
The chapter uses that idea to explain how nations end up overusing things that belong to everyone, like the atmosphere
Right.
or the oceans.
Yeah.
Every country acts in its own self-interest, even though it hurts everyone in the long run.
So it's like a global game of chicken.
Exactly.
No one wants to be the first to back down,
Yeah.
even though we know we need to work together.
And you see that in those climate change negotiations all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Developed nations saying developing nations need to cut their emissions.
Right.
But then the developing nations are like, hey, we deserve economic growth too. It just turns into finger-pointing instead of everyone working together to find solutions.
Right, and it's not just the environment, right? I think the chapter also mentions how wealth inequality is a global problem.
Yeah.
Like, billions and billions of dollars are flowing around the world, but efforts to reduce poverty, they often stop at national borders.
You got it. It's really complicated.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to fix a global plumbing problem,
Okay.
but you only focus on the leaks in your own house. That's kind of what we're doing when we ignore how connected wealth and poverty are on a global scale.
Yeah. Okay, so we need moral systems that aren't limited by borders. But trying to get every country to agree on those, that just seems impossible.
It's a huge challenge, definitely.
Yeah. And honestly, it's starting to feel kind of overwhelming. Which reminds me of another point the chapter brought up about how our own brains just aren't built to handle these huge problems.
Oh, right. You're talking about psychic numbing?
Yeah, is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's like a natural defense mechanism. We get hit with so much information about these global issues.
Right.
It's impossible to process it all emotionally. And the scale of these problems, it just makes you feel powerless.
Yeah.
And then that can lead to apathy or even denial.
Oh, I know, I've been there.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes I just have to turn off the news. It's too much.
It's understandable.
Yeah.
But the danger, like the chapter says, is that if we numb ourselves to these problems, we don't do anything about them.
Right.
We need ethical frameworks that actually empower us, not freeze us in place because the problems seem too big.
So how do we go from feeling overwhelmed to feeling like we can actually do something?
Yeah.
Like, how do we make global ethics feel personal and actionable, even though the problems themselves are so massive?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the chapter tackles it through a really interesting lens. Technology. Specifically, artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we're not just throwing our hands up in the air.
No, not at all.
There's some hope here.
Maybe.
Right.
But before we get too excited, it's really important to understand AI is a tool, okay?
Yeah.
It's not a magic solution. We're not talking about robots taking over ethical decisions.
Okay, so no robot overlords just yet.
Not quite.
Okay.
What's fascinating about AI is how good it is at analyzing huge amounts of data, finding patterns that humans might miss, and even simulating what could happen if we do different things. Think of it like a superpowered ethics advisor, helping us make better, more informed decisions.
Okay, I'm liking where this is going. So instead of just using our own brains, which are limited, to try to grapple with these super complex global problems, AI can give us an ethical boost.
Exactly. The chapter talks about how AI can be used to model the impacts of climate change. It can help us predict which areas will be hit the hardest.
Oh, wow.
Which populations are the most vulnerable. And even what will happen in the long term if we make different policy decisions.
So it's like a crystal ball.
Kind of.
That shows us the ethical results of our actions before we even do them.
Yeah. It's a powerful tool, no doubt.
Yeah.
But like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. And that's where the ethical challenges of AI itself come into play.
All right, so AI can help us see those ethical issues more clearly. But I think the question everyone's asking is, can it actually help us do something about them?
That's the real test, yeah. And the chapter gives some pretty interesting examples of how AI is already being used in ways that, directly affect ethical outcomes.
Oh, okay. Give me some real-world examples. Like, how is this actually happening?
Well, let's take that issue we talked about earlier, wealth inequality.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem, ethically and economically.
Right.
And it's tied up in all these complex global systems.
Right, and it feels like this tangled mess. How can AI even make sense of something that complicated?
It's that complexity that makes AI so useful. It can analyze tons of economic data, way more than a human could ever go through, and then show us the ethical results of different policies.
So instead of just arguing about tax systems or trade agreements based on, gut feelings or ideology, AI could tell us, based on data, what the real impact on wealth distribution would be.
Exactly. Imagine AI modeling the effects of different tax policies, right? It could show us, with real-world data, which ones would actually reduce poverty without hurting economic growth. We could get past those old political arguments and focus on what actually works.
That's pretty mind-blowing, having this data-driven ethical compass to guide policymakers toward solutions that are more fair.
That's the idea. And AI can also be really important in making sure global aid is distributed effectively and ethically, like where the need is greatest and which strategies are actually going to have a positive impact.
So less money wasted and more resources going to the people who really need them.
Absolutely. Now, switching gears a little bit, the chapter also talks about how AI could be used to deal with global health crises, which, have become these really urgent ethical dilemmas in recent years.
Yeah, the pandemic really brought those ethical issues to the forefront. Like, how do you fairly allocate resources like vaccines when there's not enough to go around?
Exactly. And during COVID, AI was already crucial for things like tracking the virus and developing vaccines. But it can go beyond that, helping us make those tough ethical choices in future health crises.
So, for example, could AI help decide who gets priority for a vaccine during a pandemic? I mean, that's a minefield ethically when supplies are limited.
It could, and it's actually already being used that way. Like during COVID, AI was used to identify communities that were more likely to get seriously ill based on things like age, underlying health conditions, and even their socioeconomic situation. That helped guide vaccine distribution in a way that was, aligned with fairness and justice.
So instead of just reacting to a crisis, AI could help us anticipate those ethical dilemmas and be more prepared.
Exactly. And as we face more global health threats, whether it's future pandemics or antibiotic resistance, AI can be this valuable tool for navigating those tough ethical decisions.
This is all pretty exciting, but I have to admit, it's a little scary too. Are we really ready to trust AI with these huge decisions that have such big ethical consequences?
That's a really good question. And as we mentioned earlier, AI itself has ethical challenges that we can't ignore.
Right, like algorithmic bias.
Yeah.
We can't just let machines make these decisions without making sure they're programmed to be fair and just. Otherwise, we could just make existing inequalities worse.
You're absolutely right. The chapter makes that point very clear. It's crucial that we design these AI systems with ethical oversight from the very beginning.
So no more hiding behind the curtain, so to speak. We have to be able to see how those ethical engines are actually working.
Exactly. And we need to bring in experts from different fields. Ethicists, technologists, social scientists, all working together to develop AI systems that are actually aligned with human values. It can't just be programmers in Silicon Valley making these decisions. We need a much bigger conversation, a more inclusive one.
Yeah, okay, so AI might be a powerful tool, but it's not a silver bullet. It's more about using AI to improve our own ethical decision-making, not replace it entirely.
Exactly. And that leads to another important point from the chapter. Even with the best AI, we still need humans to work together, to cooperate, to agree on what our ethical goals should be in the first place.
Because technology can give us the means, but it can't tell us what we should be aiming for.
Exactly. AI can analyze the data, model the outcomes, optimize for solutions, but it's up to us as a global society to decide what we want those solutions to look like. We need a shared ethical vision to guide us.
So we need, like, an ethical roadmap, a set of values that everyone can agree on to help us navigate these complicated challenges. But creating that roadmap, I mean, that seems almost impossible in a world that's so divided.
It's definitely a huge challenge. It requires us to move beyond just thinking about ourselves, whether that's national interests, short-term thinking, or our own personal biases.
It's like we need to upgrade our whole moral operating system to match the problems we're facing.
That's a great way to put it. And the chapter points out that climate justice is one area where this is especially important.
Right, because climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's a moral one, too.
Yeah.
Often the people who caused it the least are the ones suffering the most.
Exactly. And AI can help us understand those inequalities in more detail. It can show us which communities are most at risk from climate change, analyze the ethics of different climate policies, and even track how well international agreements like the Paris Agreement are actually protecting the people who are most vulnerable.
So AI could help keep us accountable, both individually and as a global community, to make sure our actions actually match our commitments to climate justice.
Exactly. It really reinforces this idea that the future of global ethics is probably going to depend on a partnership between humans and AI, each side bringing its own strengths to the table.
Humans with our sense of morality and empathy, and AI with its analytical abilities and its, ability to see these patterns on a scale we never could.
Exactly. It's a partnership that could really help create a more ethical and sustainable world.
This whole deep dive has given me so much to think about. And before we all get lost in our thoughts, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap things up with some final thoughts on the future of global ethics and what it all means for each of us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into global ethics. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've talked about the limits of traditional ethics,
Yeah.
and then the potential and also the downsides of AI.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
And as we wrap things up, I think it's important to remember this isn't just some theoretical discussion.
No, not at all.
These are issues that are happening right now. They're shaping the future, and they need our attention.
Absolutely.
Right? This isn't just a philosophy class. This is stuff that's going to affect all of us, ready or not.
Yeah.
So I think what everyone's wondering is, okay, where do we go from here? What do we actually do with all these insights? Right, that's the big question. And while the chapter doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, it does point to a change in how we think about this. We need to start thinking about global ethics, not as something way out there, but as something that's relevant to our everyday lives.
So bridging that gap between the big picture and the choices we make each day.
Exactly.
But how do we do that? It's easy to get overwhelmed by how big these problems are.
Yeah. And I think one of the most important things we can take away from this chapter is just realizing our actions have consequences that go way beyond our immediate circle.
It's like the butterfly effect, right?
Exactly.
A small thing we do here can have a ripple effect and cause something unexpected to happen on the other side of the world.
Yeah, and that awareness should guide the choices we make, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's what we buy,
right,
the companies we support, how we vote, even the conversations we have with our families and friends.
So being more conscious consumers, more engaged citizens, just generally more thoughtful about the impact we have.
Yeah. And also recognizing how interconnected we all are.
Okay.
These challenges like climate change,
Yeah.
wealth inequality, global health crises, they're not someone else's problems. They're our problems.
Right.
And we have to tackle them together.
Which brings us back to collective action.
Uh-huh.
Even if we're all doing the right thing as individuals, we still need systemic solutions.
Exactly. We have to hold our leaders accountable,
Yeah.
advocate for policies that are just and sustainable,
Right.
support organizations that are working to make the world better.
So it's a two-pronged approach, changing our own habits
Yeah.
and pushing for change on a larger scale.
Exactly. It's not one or the other. It's both.
Okay.
And it's also realizing that this is a journey, right?
Yeah.
There's no end point when it comes to ethics. It's always evolving,
Right.
always striving to do better
Yeah.
as individuals and as a whole.
Yeah, we're all kind of figuring this out together.
Yeah.
Navigating this increasingly complex world.
Yeah.
And AI can be a helpful companion on that journey.
Right. It can be. But like we talked about, it's not about letting AI tell us what's right and wrong.
Right.
It's about using it to make our own ethical decisions better, helping us see the bigger picture and make choices that align with what we believe in.
So it's about using technology to improve our own ethical thinking, our own ethical intelligence.
Exactly. And that's a pretty powerful idea. It means we're not just standing by watching these global challenges unfold.
Right.
We have the ability to shape the future through our own choices and by working together.
That's a really hopeful message. It's a call to action. And I think that's a perfect way to end this deep dive.
I agree. The future of global ethics is in our hands. Every choice we make, every action we take contributes to it.
So as you go about your day-to-day, dear listener, remember what we've talked about. Think about the impact you have on the world, big or small. Ask yourself how you can help create a more just and ethical future. Even small actions matter, especially when we all work together. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into global ethics. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep working to make the world a better place.